Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us for our second part of this racial justice seminar, Decolonization and Collective Liberation and Intersectional Solidarity. I want to thank Mike and Psychedelic Seminars for allowing us to have this platform to have these important discussions. My name is Mohawk, which is actually my chosen name. It's also my legal name. I want to give a little bit of explanation about it. I've had a Mohawk for almost 15 years. I'm also a non-binary trans person, so it's gender neutral, and I feel it's very specific to my aesthetic and kind of my rebellious demeanor. And I am aware that there is a Mohawk nation, and I'm not claiming any specific culture at all, any indigenous culture at all. But with that being said, I am still researching and reflecting to be respectful to these people and not be appropriative. And with that said, I also want to do a land acknowledgement, and I would like everyone to reflect and consider that the lands that we're on are stolen lands. Many of us here in New York City are in Lenape territory. And I also wanted to, obviously today is a major holiday for the United States. It's July 4th. It celebrates the independence of the United States. And we'll go a little bit more into that with our discussion today. We have a great panel of experts here with us today. We have Yarelix Estrada, Paula Kahn, and Danielle Herrera. I myself, again, am Mohawk Greene, and I'm going to be moderating today's discussion. And I also want to thank our moderators that will be in the chat today, which are Kwasi Aduse and Kat Kanawer. So I want to start this conversation by first addressing some of the things that came up since our last conversation. We had a number of questions that were about what is decolonization and what is collective liberation? And how is this tied into working with psychedelics? So I want us to start off by kind of defining these concepts. Paula, would you like to speak to that, or Danielle?
Yeah, I feel like it would be important for us to take a moment to think about what date today is, especially because I think it's really powerful for us to really think about where we're at in the present day in relationship to these cycles, these solar cycles, and what this date has meant historically and what happened over 200 years ago. Yeah, I think it's important for us to do our research and to self-educate and to really understand what the goals of the War for Independence were. And it's really important for us to do that work and to learn about how it was really desire for plantation owners to have more self-determination and autonomy to expand, to take more land from indigenous peoples on Turtle Island, and to preserve the system of slavery that enslaved peoples that were abducted from Africa to be exploited for their labor for the new global economy. So today is not a day of celebration. We really have to remember that there was a lot of folks of the African diaspora that fought on the side of the British because the British were the ones who promised them freedom if the British won in this war. So we really have to think about who the most oppressed were at that time. And that's folks who are of the African diaspora, that's indigenous people, that's women, that's gender nonconforming people who were all attacked under brutal extermination campaigns at this time. So today is not a day of celebration. American independence is tied to colonialism, slavery, land theft, massive forced migration through the transatlantic slave trade. So we really have to start by deconstructing the way we've been taught history. So that's all I'll say for now.
Yes, thank you so much for that, Paula. So just to totally reiterate and also support everything that is said, today is a day of mourning and also acknowledging that this land is not free for many folks. And when I think about this in terms of decolonization, or answering your question, Mohawk, on what how we're defining this. I like to refer to decolonization as a tangible unknown, especially in a society that is not possible to become post-colonial. We're sort of a neo-colonial trying to figure out how to actively decolonize, which ultimately is an unsettling, and what that tangibly looks like. So what do we mean when we say we need land back, and what does that refer to when we can't possibly get land back? And so then when it comes down to, especially in context of some of these bigger topics, which I'm so glad that all of you are joining us from the psychedelic community to talk about what decolonization means in this context, but it kind of being like everyday acts of resurgence, everyday acts, every moment acts of reclaiming reverence, of returning to the spirit, of returning to the sacred, and how we engage with every minute detail of our involvement in everything, to bring that element some soul, some life. I would love to kind of hear more of what you all think about decolonization and what questions you have about it, what it may look like for you, and kind of what directions you want to take with this conversation.
Just going to take a quick look at any questions that have been submitted just yet. Are there any folks who did want to chime in about this decolonization concept? I do see a question here that I would like to quickly address. Someone said, as an Indigenous person in Australia, I am acutely aware that my having more settler pale skin ancestry than other Indigenous Australians has made my pathway to access psychedelics easier and safer than it can be for darker folks. Darker folks in the desert growing locations have more access to our native entheogen, never illegal. In cities, darker skinned family are struggling a lot with substance misuse, seldom accessing psychedelics. Appreciate it if someone can speak to this issue. Is this something someone would like to talk about right now?
Yeah, I could hop in with really appreciate that question. Accessibility to Indigenous peoples in regards to psychedelic medicines is a topic I'm passionate on. As a psychedelic therapist and harm reduction therapist and an Indigenous person, my mother is Chiricahua Apache, my father is Yaqui and Hopi. I embody a lot of colonialism with those two tribes being ones that have had history of colonization with each other. But when it comes to psychedelics, I even start with the word psychedelic. A lot of Indigenous folks don't consider their plant medicines to be psychedelics. So that alone is like an access concern. And then when we extend this to like psychedelic medicine, psychedelic therapies, psychedelic anything, where are we struggling to provide psychoeducation to Indigenous communities to provide them the same access to healing as everybody else? So yeah, it becomes really complicated too in regards to thinking about the studies that are present for psychedelic therapies or psychedelic medicines, and their success rates usually have very low involvement of Indigenous peoples. And that is it's an issue because only 0.8% of this country is Indigenous, is of its Indigenous peoples. So oftentimes the studies have no to 0.1% Indigenous populations being tested. And then when Indigenous peoples are then trying to access these medicines for healing, they struggle with access because they'll get denied because there's only been 1.1% of people being studied for it. So there's a lot of need for talking about this in the context of how do we provide healing to Indigenous communities and provide them with the same amount of access as everybody else. And I'd love to hear everybody else's thoughts on that.
Danielle, could you actually give us a quick intro? You did mention a little bit of your background, and as others, after Danielle is finished, I would like to hear from Paula and Yarelix as well, their background, so that our audience is aware.
Yeah, for sure. So I like to speak anti-capitalistly. So before I talk about the work that I do, I like to tell people who I am as a person. First of all, I'm a poet. Second of all, I work with tarot. I like to spend time with my family and my loved ones and animals. And I am super passionate about the fields that I am working in. I am also Indigenous. Like I said, I'm Chickasaw, Apache, Yaqui, and Hopi, and Filipino as well, my mixed ancestry. What I do for work is also something that I'm really passionate about. I'm a harm reduction therapist with Harm Reduction Therapy Center in San Francisco, which provides community mental health services on the streets of San Francisco, and it's phenomenal. I love it. It's very non-traditional psychotherapy. I also work with Sage Institute for Psychedelic Therapy, which is the first ever low-income psychedelic clinic in the Bay Area, which provides low-income sliding scale therapy for folks trying to access ketamine-assisted psychotherapy and MDMA-assisted psychotherapy once it becomes legal. So that's the work that I do. I do a lot of integration work. I work with medicines, and I talk a lot about indigeneity. So that's the background I'm coming from. Thank you.
I'd love to hear from Paula next.
Hi, everyone. My name is Paula Kahn. My pronouns are she, they, and I'm decarceration strategist at Freedom for Immigrants and co-founder of Cosmovisiones Ancestrales. And Cosmovisiones Ancestrales is a pan-Indigenous mutual aid collective that advocates for Indigenous rights and environmental justice. My early politicization in decriminalization and decarceration was shaped by Black and Brown community organizers that initiated the Black Lives Matter movement, Dignity and Power Now, the LA Sheriff Civilian Oversight Commission, and the Justice LA Coalition. I'm an herbalist and I study the use of psychoactive substances. And my lineages on my mother's side are of Guatemala, of Olintepec, Quetzaltenango, Guatemala, and of the Iberian Peninsula through colonization. And on my father's side, we're German Jewish folks. I'll turn it over to Yarelix Estrada so that they can introduce themselves.
Thank you. My name is Yarelix Estrada. I use she, her pronouns. I'm currently on Seminole land because of displacement, because of the pandemic. People are doing things that they probably usually wouldn't do right now. I am a first-generation Central American, and I'd say the biggest thing that I am is a harm reductionist, and harm reductionist in all sense, for all drugs, for all things that are risky that we all do. So I currently work as a city research scientist for the New York City Department of Health. And my primary duties there is doing community-based research and also doing community-based outreach for overdose prevention for people who use drugs. And part of that is also trying to fill in the gaps or trying to shift the major structural issues that we have that tend to be abstinence-based for people who use drugs and shifting them to a more harm reduction structure. I'm also an organizer with the New York City Psychedelic Society, and that's a community-based society or whatever that is trying to build community by inviting folks in that are interested in psychedelics and also being intentional about learning about the intersections of psychedelics with all of this other stuff, all of social justice and accessibility for all people. I also organize psychedelic integration circles. One of the integration circles are public, which anyone can come to. And the other sets that I do are specifically for people of color to offer a safe space so people can come and share their experiences and be in a safe space with one another. So
I'd also like to give a little bit of my background. Once again, I'm Mohawk Greene. My pronouns are they, them. I'm an outreach coordinator with Dance Safe, which is a 501c3 harm reduction organization that mostly centers its service and outreach in nightlife, festival, kind of like more entertainment, social spaces, working mostly with what would be considered, like quote unquote recreational drug use, which is like the largest population of people who use drugs versus, those who may have a substance use disorder or something like that. So we're working with more of the people who are partying with substances or maybe just experimenting with them. I'm also the president of the local chapter, New York Dance Safe, And we do a lot of the outreach of Dance Safe here in this local community. I'm also the technical program manager at Next Harm Reduction. They are an online mail-based harm reduction service. So through nextdistro.org and through naloxoneforall.org, you can actually basically have anything you could get at a local syringe exchange, especially for people who do not have syringe exchanges accessible to them, whether it's too far away or they just don't have a car or whatever. Things are very different outside of places like New York City as far as accessibility. So you can access all sorts of supplies, including naloxone, for free through this service. And yeah, I also have done a lot of collaborative work with other organizations such as the Drug Policy Alliance. I've worked with other similar nightlife harm reduction organizations around around the world, not just around the country, in like Amsterdam and in Belgium and multiple places. I like to get around and see how everyone's doing harm reduction in these types of spaces all over the world. South Africa has probably been my favorite, just as an aside. And I also do I have like an online platform where I've done probably the majority of my work, because that's how I started before getting more involved with formal organizations, being able to reach people through social media. And yeah, that's it for us. I believe we can kind of transition into another topic here. I saw that there were some questions, but I think I'll hold off on those for just a second while I look through them, and we can talk a little bit more about coming out of this decolonization and this decolonization kind of topic and into intersectional solidarity, and how that's important with the psychedelic community. So anybody want to take the floor on that first? And just FYI, I feel like it could also overlap with, there was a question that asked, can decolonization and capitalism coexist? And I know Danielle's an anti-capitalist. I would identify as one myself. If we feel that that has to do with intersectionality, I'd love to start going off on that.
For sure. Actually, I wanted to start off with, I wanted to acknowledge that Camille isn't here. And our warmest wishes to Camille. There was an emergency in their space. So just to acknowledge their absence and their constant presence with us, all their love, please share all the love to them as you can. In regards to the question, I also totally want to hear from Yarelix and Paula on this, but I am also definitely an anti-capitalist. And, the question of can decolonization exist with capitalism is fascinating in a strange way. And I'll share this article, but decolonization is something that people speak a lot to, but must be understood as not just a metaphor. We speak to it so easily, but it's complicated because we are trying to decolonize, yet it's ultimately not possible in the land that is colonized. So ultimately it becomes a frame of mind in which we have to constantly be engaged with. And in regards to capitalism, I think of, I was just thinking about how, I try to decolonize psychotherapy in many ways. And yet in this context of psychotherapy being a business, being healing and wellness being businesses being, there's a way in which you are involved with them. And your like pathology ultimately ends up benefiting the system. So if we're trying to decolonize a system like that, we need to be really intentional about not continuing to perpetuate white settler colonialism that's embedded within those systems. So yeah, I'd love to hear more on like kind of the wider thoughts about this, but not to take up too much space on this topic, but it is a complicated one. Thank you.
Yeah, last part one of this series really talked about colonization and a global system of extraction And there was some backlash that, we've received from part 1 of this series, folks who are saying that there is no evidence for systemic oppression and that intersectionality is an ideology that is divisive. And so I think we really have to get clear on a few things, that we're still living within these systems of extermination. And that's why some of us may not be perceiving them, because they've become normalized. They've become a part of our everyday life. And it's really hard to see it from inside when you're not experiencing it yourself. So when talking about how colonization and capitalism are related, so with the forced enslavement of both folks of the African diaspora and of Indigenous people of the global majority, we have to talk about how substances that were previously used as sacraments ceremoniously were recontextualized and recodified into these systems of forced labor, of exploitative labor. So you see in different plantations or haciendas or labor camps, the use of coca leaves to try to maximize the amount of product that enslaved peoples produce for the colonizers, when previously the coca leaf was used in ceremonies to connect with certain groups' deities. We see this more in Abya Yala, which is what is commonly known as South America, more in the Incan, what was formerly the Incan Empire, the use of coca for producing the maximum product under forced labor. Then in the Caribbean, we see the use of cannabis and alcohol to also, again, yield as much product as possible, but also because people are suffering so much from being separated from their families, from seeing massive death. People are suffering. So these substances allow people to work, to continue working, and to cope with their situation. So you see cannabis, caffeine, alcohol, coca leaves, and I'm sure I might be missing sugar as well, being forced upon populations. So I think it's really important for us to recognize that there was a corruption of folks' consciousness as forced labor was imposed on people. And we see that. I have a theory that that plays into substance use disorders, substance dependency that is transmitted epigenetically sometimes. I believe that it's because of those early traumas of being forced to consume substances in this context of genocide. So I'll leave it at there for now. Could say more, but I would love to hear from my colleagues.
Yeah, thank you for that, Paula. And I think sometimes I think from the conversations that I've had with people, it's difficult to maybe conceptualize colonialism as something like it. For some people, it may just sound like a concept, right? Like it's something that they read in a book that happened one time when someone came to the U.S. and like killed some people, and it's not happening anymore. But in reality, that's what this country is built on, and that's what we're living in. Like capitalism is successful. Capitalism is able to happen because there are people at the top that are benefiting from this colonialism. And so what does that look like? That looks like billionaires that could probably fund the people who are living in poverty so that they can like get out of that poverty, but not, and instead saying, I'll give you $8 an hour to work for me and that'll be enough to keep you going, but it's not. And so I'm also anti-capitalist. I think colonialism and capitalism are tied also because capitalism tells you that you're an individual. It tells you that you don't have a community, or we're, every man for himself type of mentality. And that's not what we should be aiming to do, in my opinion. So like if we're thinking about how we support each other, how we uplift each other's voices, and how we care for one another, like the people that are most marginalized are often people that have been oppressed by the system. And these are like was mentioned, people from the African diaspora, Indigenous people, and are being oppressed now by not having access to resources, being in places. So for example, just thinking about how zoning works in this country, for example, like you see people that are in communities of color, they get like shit. Like they don't get good educational systems. They don't get access to food. They live in food deserts. And this is all intentional. It's all intentional because of histories of redlining. And this is all part of that historical process that the white people from like not that long ago decided to do. So yeah, I agree with everything that everyone has said, and just acknowledging that we're living in colonialism now and we're living in white supremacy right now.
Absolutely. Just to like add on that, I think colonialism is often thought of as just something that's a part of history, when it's actively a system that is that white supremacy is benefiting from and everybody else is not. And then I also want to acknowledge that with whiteness being this lie that you were told, right? It's the lie, the construct of race that is truly not benefiting anybody in society, yet like capitalism being this tool to convince people that you alone can become a certain role. Like you can become as rich and powerful as Trump himself, and do this by disconnecting yourself from your communities. That's a colonial mindset, right? And we see this entrenched. I saw there was a question similarly. We see this entrenched like within the psychedelic community, even seen in these very well-meaning cultures of healing and wellness, of like, okay, well, here, take this MDMA, take this psychedelic, take these go through this psilocybin experience and experience, establish a greater sense of empathy and wholeness, being all one. And that's something to be really careful with, because in that place of being all one, we have the possibility of spiritual bypass, where we are disconnected from the acknowledgement of the harm that we are capable of, and the fact that we are still individually and collectively responsible for deconstructing capitalism in the ways in which it harms everybody, and decolonizing and unsettling in every way that we possibly can. So that's something I'd also like to pull into the picture of, I do believe in psychedelics being like the place where we can do a ton of healing for our collective liberation. And that could be a place where the new world is possible, where we are all one. But ultimately that that sort of like cloaks us from the responsibility and the potential for harm.
And to build on that, when we are talking about decolonization, we're talking about moving away from systematized, meaning that the governmental institutions have created the infrastructure and pass laws to sustain an infrastructure that normalizes extermination. So we have to understand that colonization is a culture of extermination. Colonization is genocidal culture, and genocide is the extermination of a people's. Ethnocide is the extermination, the systemic extermination of their culture, cultural identity. So thinking about how when European colonizers ravaged places around the world, they destroyed texts, they burned texts, they destroyed temples, they destroyed sacred sites, they destroyed ritual objects, they targeted spiritual leaders. That was done systematically, that was done by design to stupefy a peoples, and to kill the elders is to disconnect people from knowledge, especially in cultures where knowledge is transmitted orally. So when we talk about decolonization, we're talking about healing from that systemic killing of culture, from the systemic disconnect of our ancestral knowledges. We also have to talk about how colonization is entrenched in misogyny and the targeting of gender nonconforming people, two-spirit people, females. So we talk about femicide too. We talk about the sexual violence that was central to the colonial project that we continue to see today, with the targeting of Black trans folks, with the targeting of trans folks being the most vulnerable people in our society. So when we talk about decolonization, we're talking about freedom for everyone, and we're really analyzing who have been the most targeted historically. And so we're also talking about ecocide. Right now, we're in a climate crisis. We really can't afford to continue the patterns of extraction on this planetary level. So when we're talking about decolonizing, we're talking about changing a system that is based in extraction and exploitation, the extraction of labor, the extraction of resources from the land. And that's at the core of capitalism. Capitalism is possible because of the extraction of both resources and labor. The resources came from the colonies, the raw materials of the colonies that were produced by enslaved peoples that were then shipped around the world. So we're really talking about dismantling this global economy that is sourced in the mass extermination of people, culture, resources, and knowledge.
All right, thank you for that, everybody. So actually, I kind of want to piggyback off of what Paula and Yarelix were both saying. To a degree about, so a lot of people tend to look at this stuff as this is some isolated event that happened in the past, since we have reached something that looks more like equality today, but there's all these subtle things that are happening that kind of still keep us oppressed in this way. Like we were talking about the spiritual bypassing, where people aren't really acknowledging the type of harm they can be doing by kind of avoiding these topics that might be uncomfortable, that might acknowledge their privilege and things of that nature. There's a lot of things that are done by design, like for example, in healthcare, in our healthcare systems, even to this day, Black people are still believed to have a higher pain tolerance, or, sometimes women are assumed to be exaggerating their pain. So there's a lot of stuff that still goes on in our systems today that make even things like healthcare inaccessible or torturous for people. And with that said, I kind of want to segue into talking about harm reduction. How has harm reduction been colonized itself? Both myself and Yarelix are really active in doing harm reduction work. It might not be apparent to people outside of this specific movement and that these specific organizations that handle these types of services, how harm reduction has somewhat been colonized and can be seen even as another form of policing. And also, harm reduction is ultimately a healthcare service. It's, like a public health service. It's allowing people to have the right information and resources to be able to make much safer choices that concern their health, whether it's physical or mental. That could be what they know about a certain substance. How can they access substances that are not adulterated or misrepresented? How much of this substance can they take? What the experience will be? What kind of precautions should they take? Especially when it comes to things like psychedelics, set and setting are really important considerations when using these types of substances. So I would like to kind of get into an overall topic of how is harm reduction colonized, and also how is psychotherapy colonized, and maybe any other forms of our healthcare system. And honestly, I can start with that. In the beginning, as part of my introduction, I mentioned that I work with a mail-based syringe exchange type service that does ship out supplies that you could normally find in a syringe exchange, including things like naloxone, and you can get those things for free. So Next Harm Reduction was basically founded on the principle that harm reduction is colonized. A lot of the existing programs tend to address the white population. It's not the most marginalized populations. It's not reaching the BIPOC communities. And for people who are not aware, BIPOC stands for Black and Indigenous people of color. These are some of our most marginalized communities of color that are not able to access these resources that are life-saving, that can create stability, especially since in our current society, a lot of our wealth has been stripped away generationally, historically. I mean, I can speak with the Black community, that anytime that there was wealth built within the community on our own, it was destroyed. You can look back to things like Black Wall Street, where, you know, there was like a whole thriving community, and due to an incident where, you know, a racist incident, they decided to go burn down the entire community. Or for example, here in New York City, Central Park used to be a thriving community full of Black people called Seneca Village. They had multiple schools and churches. You know, I think it had a 300 and something person Black population. And basically all of that has been wiped out, and now it's just a giant park in the middle of Manhattan. So, you know, we have been stripped away of these resources to thrive and in some way sustain. And there's also been things like crack leaked into our communities, people who are, people who lack resources, have traumas. You know, there's a high rate of some sort of trauma, some of which is also intergenerational. And with those traumas, I believe I said it in the last seminar, that trauma is the, well, maybe it was actually on a podcast or something, but trauma has kind of been identified as the gateway drug. Like no drug, you know, not marijuana, not, you know, alcohol or anything that, you know, we identify as like a psychoactive substance, but the real gateway to something like a substance abuse disorder or any other kind of like destructive, problematic drug use, drug patterns is trauma. And these communities have a lot of that because of our history and our present day. And so that we're trying to do a lot of centering of these communities to provide them with access to the resources that, you know, white or white adjacent counterparts have had for a much longer period of time. And my role at Dance Safe is sort of involved with this as well. Like Dance Safe is actually a national organization, and there's chapters all over the country. And here, you know, every chapter might do something a little bit differently because it might depend on what their community needs. Here in New York City, we have an extremely diverse population. We have a huge bustling, you know, scene. I don't even want to just say specific to music, but like, you know, that's what we focus on primarily. And but we have all sorts of cultures here. There's like over 200 languages being spoken here. There's a lot of it's a big melting pot. So, you know, we really do have to address more than just what would be considered like the majority population outside of a place like New York City, and not just racially a marginalized community. Like I said, I'm a non-binary trans individual. The LGBTQ plus community is heavily marginalized, is stigmatized. And then if you add the layer of, you know, also being, you know, like Black or Indigenous within that identity, then that just kind of adds an additional layer of being oppressed and lacking resources and access. And so I've been doing a lot of work to try to make sure that these communities that are heavily stigmatized and marginalized are getting access to these same resources. A lot of people have no clue about even the most, what we might consider the most basic harm reduction concepts, like testing your substances, or, you know, understanding dosing, you know, like the dose makes the poison kind of deal. Like, you know, there's a lot of misinformation that happens in these spaces. They don't have access to the same level of education, like Yarelix was saying. And this is not something that's even being it's not even mainstream education. So if it's not mainstream education, then it's even more obscured for people who lack access to, you know, being able to like do a lot of this research. They may not even understand that they can look into Dance Safe and look into these forums that talk about harm reduction, you know, when you're using substances recreationally. And, you know, I think I just wanted to start there because a lot of what my work is revolving around is giving these communities that typically don't have much access to harm reduction, who have very high rates of substance use, you know, making sure that they are now starting to get the same resources that everyone else has had, especially considering that they are also the most prosecuted, you know, the most targeted when it comes to just even the, you know, policing around drug use, since the majority of these substances are still illegal, or scheduled in such a way that, you know, only certain people are able to gain access to it. And yeah, I think I've really said a lot on that. So anyone else feel free to jump in on this topic of decolonizing psychotherapy or healthcare.
Yeah, so I wanted to talk a little bit, piggybacking off the things that you said about lack of accessibility to communities of color and things like that. So I work in overdose prevention, and overdose is a huge issue. Like, we're having all these different layers of like crises, right? So we're having COVID, and that's eviscerating communities of color in big cities. We have the state violence towards Black people by police, and then we also have overdose. Like, the overdose crisis has been happening since 2015. And in the last year, there were nearly 70,000 people that died of a drug overdose. A lot of these deaths are largely preventable. Like, if we could distribute naloxone to people, that could potentially cause some people to not die because they could reverse their overdoses. But the issues around overdose are largely fueled by the war on drugs and prohibition. So in talk one, the one before this one, there was a lot of conversation about what the war on drugs is, what it looks like. But I'll just say that we have drug laws in this country not because they are meant to keep us safe. There are drug laws in this country to criminalize us. So there are people that are in government power that said, hey, I want to criminalize Mexican people, make marijuana illegal. Hey, I want to criminalize people that are from Asian countries, let's make opium illegal because that's a cultural use. Let's make crack cocaine illegal, even though we put it in Black communities, and then arrest them for it. So like these are how these drug laws are shaped. In order to think that we could have a system outside of this is not radical. Like, there are other countries that are already doing this. There are countries that don't have Schedule I substances that if I find heroin on you, I have to arrest you. Like, that doesn't exist in other places, and we can fight for that. So I just want to acknowledge that Schedule I substances are not deemed that because they are dangerous, because they're proven to be dangerous. Like, marijuana and psilocybin are Schedule I, and so is heroin, and so is meth, and so are these other substances. But I think it's important to talk about, so like the drug war came in and it's ravaged a lot of communities, right? And communities of color, low-income people, et cetera. And that has led to economic, like lack of economic stability. It has led to lack of stability within families. And so when people start having issues with overdose, and when people have issues with overdose, sometimes they are because of underlying mental health issues that come from trauma, that's passed down from a community level, but also on an individual level. And so I work for the Department of Health. That is a very large institution, and I'm not representing them at all. I am not and everything that I say is my own opinion, but I will speak from my experience there that there are policies or there are programs that are put in place, and they're like, oh, this is going to work. This is going to decrease the overdose in New York City. And they're like small programs that help people that are already housed. They help people that that are already engaged in some sort of mental health treatment. They engage people that have some of their basic needs met. So then when these plans get implemented, and then we see in the new year, okay, what has happened? Overdoses in the white communities have gone down. They've gone up in Black and brown communities. So clearly these programs that the government is trying to implement aren't working. One, because all the leadership that exists in those organizations are white. Two, because they don't listen to people of color that come in and tell them, like, these need to be culturally appropriate interventions, because if not, they're not going to work. And then we're seeing that there's these huge spikes in overdoses in Black and brown communities that continue up until now. And because of everything that's going on with how COVID is destabilizing the economy and how it's destabilizing everything, like, there's going to be bigger spikes in overdoses after this. And so drug use is just a way of seeing this intersectionality, right? Because if I'm someone that wants to get drug treatment, like, first of all, I may not be able to afford it because it's expensive. Second of all, if I'm someone who's queer or gender nonconforming, I may not feel safe in these like very patriarchal, very restrictive settings. And also, if I'm undocumented, I really can't look for any treatment, or because I'm afraid of getting deported, because the state is trying to get me out of the country and kill me, you know? And so I think, like, when we're talking about intersectionality, like, it's important to think about what factors are working against people in order to access services. And someone asked in the chat about how does this relate to psychedelics? Okay, so people love to talk about all the ways that psychedelics are good for people, right? And how they're helpful and why we should be promoting them. And one of the things that I see is why we should be using psychedelics to help with overdose, with substance use, right? And so, great. So we're going to talk about overdose and substance and psychedelics. So if I'm someone that is undocumented, I am unhoused, I'm queer and gender nonconforming, and I have a substance use disorder because I'm traumatized and I have underlying mental health issues. If I do psychedelics and do it in a controlled setting and I get some sort of healing because I figure out some things about myself that feel like self-love, like some of the things that we love about psychedelics, the self-love, the self-acceptance, this unity. But then I get sent back out to be re-traumatized by people that are trying to kill me, people that are trying to rape me, people that are trying to harm me, and not helping me get housed, not helping me have sustainable mental health treatment, not having me just be able to be myself in a safe space. What is the psychedelics really doing? And on the flip side of that, there's a lot of people that use a ton of psychedelics and they don't change at all. They stay more rooted in their mindsets. And because a lot of people in the psychedelic community have contacted us and saying, what you're saying is divisive. And we're trying to understand, like, we're saying that psychedelics could be a modality for healing, but we need to understand every single person that wants access to this for healing, because healing looks different for everyone. And if we don't acknowledge that and look into the history of what colonialism is and why people are so oppressed, we're never going to know how to give equal access to everyone, not just people who are, researchers and people who are Michael Pollan and people who are like very popular in the media. Like, we need to talk about it for everyone if we want it to be true healing for the entire community.
I love that, Yarelix. Thank you so much. Snaps forever. To totally kind of bounce off of that, just what came up for me was this experience of, being somebody who's been in the psychedelic community for a while now, and just actually very recently coming out shows how white the community is, and I'll explain why. Frankly, it's not safe to be a person of color running around doing a bunch of psychedelics. Let's compare the difference between somebody who is, white hippie, totally awesome person, but they're running around their campus on LSD, and say they're starting to have a bad experience. Say they're stopped by campus police. They're in a completely different scenario than if a Black person or an Indigenous person is having a shared experience that looks pretty much exactly like that. Also, similarly, and I'll say this over the internet, obviously, like, I do drugs and I need to be able to say that I do drugs. But yet that's a risk every time I say it, because I could be criminalized for my entire life, right? But yet these elements, these drugs are sacred to me. They are what I call my religion, and they've been embedded in my culture for my entire existence. And it's necessary for us to acknowledge that we aren't experiencing the psychedelic renaissance in the same place, because of this construct of race and because of our how we could be criminalized. Like, if we really want to provide reparations, for example, then we need to pretty much free everybody out of prison right now who is being incarcerated for a drug crime. And then consider that while, there's 970 people here right now. And I suppose, I'm going to assume that all of you are supporting drug use, psychedelic use, oftentimes not drug use of other drugs. And let's look at that. Why are some drugs not as great as psychedelics? What's happening there? Let's play with it, right? But when we get to be home and have our deep internal healing psychedelic experiences and not be criminalized, why are there people who are, we're all one, right? If we're all human underneath our skin, why are people criminalized then for such low level drug crimes? So there's a lot on that. And I do want to speak to what this looks like kind of in psychedelic therapy real quickly, just from my experience in working with Sage Institute. And we're trying to create something that does not exist, which is accessible psychedelic therapy, which means, therapy that could be profoundly impactful both for the integration of psychedelic medicines and experiencing psychedelics within therapy to heal years of trauma, to heal like treatment-resistant depression. And in order to do this, we've completely changed the model, and we have sliding scale. I have a client who I see for $15 an hour because they're a two-spirit Indigenous person who is not stably housed right now. And that is what we should be doing. We should be providing them access with medicines that psychedelic medicines exist partly because we've been inspired by Indigenous cultures and the way that these medicines have been used for healing. So that's the only thing we should be doing. And yet there's still so many complications, right? Because our wait list is pretty much comprised of primarily white folks who are asking for a lower fee, reasonably so, right? But it's a lot of people who are in the psychedelic renaissance. And so we're complicated. It's complicated. We're trying to figure out who to serve with our limited staff as well, right? Like there's very few psychedelic therapists of color. There's very few therapists of color. And we can extend this beyond the whole thing that therapy in itself is the widest construct ever. And also, like, why do we expect Black and Indigenous folks to even trust Western medicine when, like, Tungskasi experiment? Like, we have so many examples of reasons why these Western medical model has been harmful, right? So just a lot of things that I'm encouraging everybody to like play with in terms of like what is my experience with being a drug user? How does my experience look different from yours? From, you know, my supervisor at harm reduction, who's this radical Black man. How is his different, right? We can't exist in the same way, and we're navigating completely different worlds because of that.
Yeah, so to echo what my colleagues have been saying, this is an access issue. It's not only an access issue, but it's an issue of mass incarceration. So I think it's really important for us to recognize that slavery has not been abolished. When slavery was supposedly abolished, it was done so under the condition, or if someone had committed a crime, then they could be enslaved with the 13th Amendment. So it's really important for us to recognize that we have not abolished slavery. There is still ongoing exploitative prison labor that's been happening that truly amounts to human trafficking. We don't talk about it enough, but the US is guilty of trafficking humans into prisons and then exploiting them for their labor, continuing the patterns of extraction for the profiteering of an elite minority. So we have to talk about how because of the 13th Amendment, this also incentivized private prison industry to expand during the 20th century. And so we have to talk about, I mean, we're talking about access, but we're also, when we talk about access, we have to recognize that, as folks had said in the previous part of this series, that the war on drugs is a tool for social control, and it's a tool for exclusion. So we have to think about a lot of things. That there is a global demand for drugs that is fueled by the global north, specifically the United States and European countries, that fuel the demand, not just for stimulants and opiates, but also for sacred plant medicine, for plantas maestras. There is this global demand, and yet the global demand is driving the extractive industries, is driving armed violence by militarized cartels that are actually in alignment politically with the people in power of the countries where cartels are in operation. We have to ask ourselves, where is that money coming from that funds narco dictatorships? And that also, where do the weapons come from? Who are the weapons producers that are being supplied? It may seem like this is not connected to access to decolonized therapeutic models, but it totally is, because the waging of war on Indigenous communities, on communities of the African diaspora, wage trauma in those communities, and ongoing trauma keeps people oppressed. So just trying to track all of my thoughts and ideas, but So yeah, going back to the U.S. drives the demand for drugs, simultaneously provides the weapons to the narco dictatorships that also get used by cartels that wage war on indigenous communities south of the U.S.-Mexico border, and really coerces people to be displaced from their ancestral lands so that those lands can be plundered and extracted from. And so folks are put into pipelines of forced migration to the US-Mexico border. And I want to talk about this because there is a really important history of how the war on drugs is correlated to border expansion with the US-Mexico border, and all of the trauma that has waged on indigenous and mixed communities along the border and south of the border. And so when we talk about decriminalizing psychedelics, such as psilocybin, hickory, otherwise known as peyote, when we talk about the decriminalization of wachuma, when we talk about the decriminalization of iboga, we're not recognizing, or what I've seen really stand out as a trend amongst the decriminalized nature movement and other folks that are not looking at this from an intersectional lens. For those who are not familiar with the term intersectionality, it's a term that was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, scholar, a Black feminist scholar, who is describing how we experience oppression, power, and privilege as a product of the layering of our identities, including ability, disability, gender, class, race, sexual orientation, how all of these overlapping identities inform how we experience a world under the legacies of colonialism and slavery. So returning back to right. So when we're going into this movement of decriminalizing psychedelics without an intersectional lens, we're really not taking into consideration the global impact of the demand for psychoactive substances. We also have to recognize who are the producers of the poppies that supply the pharmaceuticals, the opiate pharmaceuticals. Are they getting properly paid for their labor? Are they being subjected to militarized violence? So all of these things are super important for us to take into account. Like, what are the rights of coca leaf cultivators? What are the rights of poppy cultivators? Are the laboratories in Europe, in the US, in China, are those laboratories paying rightfully for their labor? What are the economic relationships underpinning that production? And do those folks have access to decolonized therapeutic spaces? And guess what? The answer is no, because they're producing the drugs for the global elite and for people north of the border in Europe. So just really wanting to talk more about the US-Mexico border. We'll get to that later, but incarcerated peoples do not have access to plant ceremonies the way that folks are advocating for the legalization of.
Thank you so much, everyone. I also wanted to just add a personal experience real quick. So I believe it was Danielle who mentioned something about having access to therapists that are of color. There's so few, there's waiting lists. And a lot of us who have been traumatized by people, by colonizers, do not want to see someone who's, who may have these racial biases, these implicit biases and things like that. I've had many personal experiences with practitioners, whether it's with physical health or mental health, gaslighting me, or they have very little knowledge on drug use. So I'm often stigmatized. It's very, some people are denied medications that could be used for them in this context if they presume that you're going to have some sort of problematic use pattern with it. So there's a lot of discrimination in these spaces, and there are a lot of folks, like myself, who are, Black or of, some marginalized identity, like LGBTQ, who do not even feel safe if they can even access, whether it's affordable, whether it's a financial access or a geographic access, do not even feel safe seeking out these spaces. I currently do not even have a primary care physician. I've had to basically fire all of them. I finally found a Black therapist who's also a woman. So I want to shout out Yarelix for that for helping me out. My 2-year journey for looking for one maybe has finally come to an end, but it's so rare. You know, and I want people to understand that this is like real. It's not just, you know, people like projecting or exaggerating. Like, this is a very common issue. I've also done, like, I've just asked a lot of my friends, you know, what their experiences were with being a drug user in trying to seek out healthcare. And when I don't want to get sidetracked, but like, insurance is a whole other thing. You know, if you're being ID'd as like a drug user for any reason that's not like prescribed drug use, your insurance may go up. If you are, you know, if you're a parent, you might lose your children. It's like all these different things that make it very, very difficult for people to access healthcare services. And with that being said, I mean, we've talked a lot about the Black and Indigenous community, you know, which is basically, you know, these people who are citizens of this land. So I'd like to kind of migrate into, you know, transition into the topic of immigration and migrant justice. These are people who do not have citizenship here, and therefore do not have the same, well, in theory, the same rights that all of us who have, but may not necessarily actually have, but under the law are definitely denied a number of rights.
Thank you. So I think it's important for us to remember that Indigenous peoples have been constructed as aliens during the campaigns of colonization in what is known as the United States. And we have to think about the war on drugs as running parallel to this myth of citizenship, because citizenship has been a myth in the history and genealogy of the United States. Citizenship is a construct to exclude the ancestral peoples of these lands, and the war on drugs is used as a means to continue excluding people from having their full rights recognized on these lands. We see that with the Chinese Exclusion Acts at the end of the 1800s. The Chinese Exclusion Acts set the precedent for the modern detention and deportation regime, and some of the justifications for detaining and deporting Chinese laborers that also were coerced to come and build the railroads in the West. There was propaganda that was created to associate them with opium use. This was mentioned during the Part 1 seminar, but just to remind folks, in case folks have forgotten, or for those who are just joining us for this part. So there was lots of propaganda that was created that was to instill fear into white populations that Chinese men were luring white women into opium dens and were getting them high. And it was a propaganda tactic to justify the detention of Chinese laborers and to put them on the conveyor belt to deportation. And then it's really important for us to remember that a justification for border expansion was to construct Mexican males as dangerous criminal rapists who were selling marijuana to school-aged children, and who, upon smoking marijuana, were crazed with savage-like tendencies and tendencies to rape. And so we really have to remember, because again, we have to disrupt the collective historical amnesia that has strategically been forced upon us through our school education. We have to remember that during the Mexican-American War, during the revolution in Mexico, there was a lot of fear along the US-Mexico border of revolutionaries, and that the Mexican Revolution would spill into the United States. There was fear of the spread of communism. And so I'm just gonna read a little excerpt from a paper I wrote a few years ago that is based on a book that I highly recommend for folks. It's called Drug Wars, The Political Economy of Narcotics by Curtis Mares. And and I think it's really important to emphasize this history because we see the same rhetoric being used by the white supremacist dictator Donald Trump when he's doing his campaign early in his presidential campaign before taking power. He uses the same sort of rhetoric and he casts that construct of drug smuggling rapists on Central American immigrants. So after the Mexican-American War, the militarization of the US-Mexico border and bringing of anti-marijuana policy was further imagined and advanced when many Mexicans dispersed north of the border during and after the Mexican Revolution from the 1910 to 1930s. The wave of new revolutionary immigrants sparked US state discourses and practices over citizenship, border control, and state police power. The US government adopted anti-communist and anti-drug discourses in order to legitimize policing the border and prevent the revolution from spreading into the US. In the 1930s, Mexican workers were commonly criminalized as drug smugglers and users. This occurred during Harry J. Anslinger's term as commissioner of the Bureau of Narcotics. He persisted in terrorizing the public of marijuana through the employment of incendiary racist language. He declared 50% of the violent crimes committed by Mexicans, Turks, Filipinos, Greeks, Spaniards, Latin Americans, and Negroes could be traced to the abuse of marijuana. Anti-immigrant sentiments can be further traced to 19th century subversive non-Anglo border culture. When the border was drawn at the end of the US-Mexican War in 1848, Mexicans and natives used this freshly imagined incision as an opportunity to engage in profitable trade. They would cross the border to one side, raid settlements, and then trade the acquired loot, usually horses, captives, and guns. And it's important to recognize they were looting settlers like Europeans, people of European descent, Anglos. They were robbing their settlements. They would flee persecution by crossing the border to the opposite side. Ever since its conception, the authority of the border has been undermined by smuggling contraband. At the same time of the Mexican Revolution, whilst many Mexicans were unemployed, the cultivation and distribution of marijuana became a source of income that many Mexicans on both sides of the border. Large supplies of the plant were brought into the states through border towns and major cities. By 1928, hundreds of Mexicans in El Paso were employed as smugglers of cocaine, morphine, opium, and marijuana. They were recruited from the working class barrios of border towns and became a part of collaborative, geographically dispersed labor networks within the informal sectors of the trans-border economy. Since Mexicans were organizing themselves to use the new border to their advantage, the United States continued to build a discourse in response to the threat of savvy, entrepreneurial, border-crossing Mexicans. The organized groups of Mexican smugglers were compared to radical Mexican labor unions and the fact that weapons were simultaneously smuggled out into Mexico-led United States. State officials to associate this led state officials to associate these marijuana traffickers with Soviet revolutionaries. So I could keep on reading, but I think something here to emphasize is that the borderlands were composed of guerrilla fighters, saboteurs, labor organizers, and strikers. Anarcho-syndicalists populating the area called for the formation of international proletariat solidarities in order to launch a millennial war against state-sponsored capitalism. They attacked private property, state protection towards it, promoted governance from the ground, advocated for direct actions such as general strikes, industrial sabotage, and violent confrontation. They encourage the collective ownership of property and a mutual aid ethic. So given that there is this radical history along the US-Mexico border, we really need to understand why the war on drugs was designed to incarcerate people using psychoactive substances for their economic resilience, for thriving, for self-medication. It's all been done strategically. I know that in New York, the campaigns against cannabis, marijuana during Harry Anslinger's term was in response to the thriving use of marijuana in jazz clubs and the fear of interracial relations between Black males and white females. And that was also used in the propaganda against marijuana. And I can talk more about immigration, but I'd love to hear from my colleagues as well.
Okay, so I mean, actually, it sounds like we might have too much more to say on that particular topic, but I will, kind of like do sort of some closing remarks before we go into questions, because there are a number of questions that I would like for people to have answered. So a lot of what we've been talking about this entire time has been how a lot of these policies, how colonialism has impacted these communities, whether it's BIPOC communities or migrant communities, from day one into today. And a response that we've had from a number of people to this series in general is that a lot of people don't understand what systemic racism is, and it's a very difficult thing to answer because it's just such a broad topic, and all of these examples are basically different ways that systemic racism exists. Having this 13th Amendment that still allows slavery to occur, having all of these laws that bar access to healing us psychoactive substances, having these biases in our healthcare, having these just disparities in like a wealth gap that prevent different communities, marginalized communities, to access these services, or different educational opportunities that create a lack of diversity in healthcare and different systems that will then help address these marginalized communities. And with that, unless there's anything anyone would like to chime in about, I was going to then jump into some questions, which I think start to touch on these topics. All right, so if there's nothing else to be said on that, I would like to now start looking at the questions that have been voted up. So one of our top questions that we have here, which I think is extremely relevant to what we were just closing with, is Sammy asks, how can non-natives who access sacred medicines show up to decolonize their healing process?
Yeah, I'm happy to answer that, or to start it out. So I think it's absolutely necessary, especially for those who believe that we are all one, and we are all one, but that doesn't mean that we can ignore what's happening to our relatives who are incarcerated, or who are forced to migrate, or who are facing state violence because of the extractive industries waged by global capitalism. I think it's important for us to align ourselves in solidarity with those most impacted and targeted by these systems. So I think we all need to be participating in dismantling prisons. We need to be talking about what it means to act in solidarity with those who are persecuted by immigration customs enforcement, by Customs and Border Patrol. We need to be talking about how we show up, how we redistribute our resources, and we need to be talking about reparations. Right now, there's a federal bill, and in some states, there are bills at the state level to operationalize reparations to be paid to folks of the African diaspora. So I think we need to get active, and we need to get loud about these issues. And we can do that by talking to in our state government in California, we would be talking to our assembly members, our senators, and at the federal level, we would be talking to our congressional representatives and our senators. So definitely get your meetings in with congressional staff. Make that effort. I think it's really important for us to talk about abolition and to think about the Underground Railroad. It's really important for us to understand how the Underground Railroad was in operation, and to talk about how we participate in iterations of the Underground Railroad, because right now people are being terrorized by the detention deportation regime, and people are being held in immigrant prisons where the violent acts happening in there amount to crimes against humanity. There are mass atrocities happening in immigrant prisons. And because of what I shared earlier, we know that people are being forced to migrate because of the global arms trade that is so closely, that is totally intertwined with the war on drugs and how the US has exported the war on drugs to other countries. So I think that we need to be opening up our homes so that people can get out of immigrant prisons, and folks can learn more about how to do this by visiting Freedom for Immigrants website and going to the Join Us tab and clicking on Sponsor an Immigrant. We need to be collectivizing our resources to support people in their community integration processes upon being released from these torture sites. And there is so much more that we can do. We can be directing our money to bail funds. So you can go to the National Bail Fund Network and share your resources and really make a plan of how you're going to be redistributing the resources that you do have access to. And I could say more, but I would love to hear from from the other participants.
Yes, yes to all of that. Yes. And I'll add on some kind of, I think of this question a lot in terms of, and I get this question a lot from my clients and from just everybody who knows me in regards to like, well, what can I do as somebody who is not Indigenous? What does true solidarity look like? What does land back really mean? What does rent is due really mean when I repeat these things over and over again? And I want to say thank you to all my community members who are so patient with my constant answers for this. And I'm actually going to share an article by Camille, who was supposed to be here, and wasn't able to due to an emergency. And Camille has a way of describing this void that is experienced in whiteness that I think is critical to understand. So there's that. So the violence of the void, I think, is something to be aware of for folks who are who identify as American, who identify as not being Indigenous to this land, and then having this experience, often, not all the time, of like disconnect from indigeneity or from disconnect from their own culture. And that is something to be really aware of and to be held with a lot of compassion. And I know that I can also get into this place where I'm like both angry with that, right? Like as an Indigenous person, like you don't, and how many times I've been told to go back to my own country, which is complicated and fun to say this is my country every time that happens. But with that void, right? What can we do with that empty space, that complicated place of grief of, I want to return back to the sacred. I want to have rituals, but I don't want to appropriate, right? And what I would say is, there's a couple things. One is knowing that you have rich, beautiful history, your own Indigenous cultures, you have your own ancestors, and they're not mine, but they're yours. And I would encourage in any way that is accessible to you to continue to explore those places. I would say a great place to do that is in therapy, truly. And I know I'm just also saying this in regards to this job security for me, but I really do think like if you could to set a commitment to exploring intergenerational places, intergenerational trauma does not discriminate. And for a lot of folks, a lot of like European settlers and who are now American, who don't know their motherland, to encourage like understanding where has the trauma also lived within the body, right? And acknowledging that a lot of European settler ancestors have experienced a lot of trauma. They were refugees from, being burned at the stake for a lot of Indigenous practices of herbalism, of different pagan rituals. And those rituals are magical and beautiful and can be really accessible and powerful. And really, they can really support the healing that is possible within psychedelic medicines. And I would encourage that, with my clients, whenever we do any type of psychedelic integration or we do a psychedelic ritual whatsoever, we set an altar up. And on that altar, I encourage them to bring different objects that will make the space sacred. And we have lots of conversations. All of my clients who, a huge diversity in regards to my clients, like know that we talk about decolonization often. We talk about capitalism often, the internalization of those concepts. And it's a constant thread. And we're not doing it this is not just happening between me and my Indigenous clients. This is happening between me and my white clients kind of more often than not, because it's ultimately harmful to everybody, So I would encourage that. I also encourage, if you do feel like there's a disconnect to your own like Indigenous culture, I want to remind you that you get to become an ancestor. And I want to say this very clearly. Like, if you feel disconnected and that is not accessible in any way, I my heart is broken for you in that place, and I'm so sorry, and I know what that's like, okay? But you still will be somebody's favorite ancestor, and you get to intentionally create a place where 7 generations from now, you have created a whole world of new rituals and new ways of showing up and new ways of dedicating yourself to these movements that will be embedded into the genetics of all of your descendants. And I'm looking forward to that day. I'm looking forward to my descendants and your descendants. And I guess that's where, you know, there's pain there. We are our ancestors' wildest dreams in every way. The resilience lives within you. If intergenerational trauma exists, so does intergenerational joy. So does intergenerational wisdom. So I'm encouraging that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Danielle. I almost had some tears like starting to water up there in my eyes, but the show must go on. You know, like that void is real. And you also mentioned the concept of intergenerational trauma. And I don't know if there's time to speak on this, but it's actually been scientifically studied on worms that there's, you know, set like these like traumatic experiences are basically passed down from generation to generation, like within a genetic makeup. Danielle, would you like to expand on that a little bit more?
Yeah, I actually just shared the article for the worms. Yeah, this is like the scientific background to epigenetics being an actual thing, and it's I want to encourage everybody to know that intergenerational trauma just simply exists. We are embedded genetically with everything from our ancestors. So you have ancestors, okay? The worm study is basically that, you know, I mean, to super extremely simplify it, you take one worm, you traumatize it. It has 7 to 14 generations of babies. And within all of those babies, the trauma is embedded into the code, right? And so when we talk about settler colonialism, for the three, there's a triad in settler colonialism. It's settler, slave, and indigenous, right? So in all of those bodies, there's different traumas happening. And to this point in the day, we are still holding those traumas from our ancestors, right? So to be like, a lot of this is encouraging like somatic ritual. We can go to therapy and intellectualize and process emotions through that cognitive realm. But one thing I can offer you from just Indigenous practices and decolonizing psychotherapy is to kind of scrap that and acknowledge that these things cannot just be healed from intellectual processing, nor through just taking a pill, like in some form, just as we've been taught. We're great capitalists, we're great you know, settlers, whatever. But like instead, that there's a huge part of emotional, spiritual, like stuff that we have to acknowledge and just be a part of. So yeah, I'm sure you all know it. The worm study is epigenetics and everything, but just to acknowledge that it's living within us, and it's not completely our fault, but we also are responsible for healing.
Yeah, and I also wanted to thank you, Danielle. It was beautiful. I'm just like, wow. I don't feel, yeah, you made me feel good. It's good. But I just wanted to add from like a practical perspective and from like a policy perspective, because those are the realms that I like tend to reside more in. Because of the violence and because of the history that a lot of these sacred medicines have, like we have to acknowledge what current Indigenous people that are still alive, that are still protecting these medicines, like what they want, right? And so I think about how things like peyote are being overharvested, right? And yet we're seeing campaigns like Decriminalize Nature that are including language around the use of peyote without working alongside the Native American Church to see what exactly they would want with that specific substance, like how they would want that to be framed, or how the education around that should be done. So I think before engaging with any particular plant medicine, think about like where's this coming from? Like what culture is this being extracted from? Is this being sourced fairly? Is this being harmful to someone's community? Is my use as a non-Indigenous person taking away from someone who has, you know, it's part of their culture, and they may not have access or may have reduced access because of my use, right? So that's one place to start. And also just educating yourself on the policies that continue to do this colonialism. Because if we're supporting policies that are saying, let's bring all the ayahuasca to the US, let's bring all the peyote into my house, even though I am a non-native person, like that is colonialism. We have to acknowledge what the Indigenous people that hold these medicines want, and then work in relationship with them to write these policies, not say, oh, but I'm deserving of healing, I want healing now. That's colonialism, and that's not how we decolonize. So yeah, just wanted to add that in.
So really briefly, I just wanted to echo what Yarelix is saying and wanted to direct folks to the UN Declaration of Indigenous Peoples' Rights and acknowledge that there is a lot of room for critique there. But if you look at the 19th article is on consent, it's on consent, cooperation. Oh, I'm forgetting the third one, but yeah, definitely look at the 13th article there. It's on consultation. Okay, yeah, consultation. So yeah, echoing what Yarelix was saying, it's really important for folks to be in dialogue with tribal leaders and really understanding what folks' access is to the medicine, because we know with peyote, it's endangered, and we know with psilocybin right now, there are efforts to commercialize the use of psilocybin, but there's not consultation happening with Mazatec peoples or other peoples who have historically used psilocybin mushrooms in ceremonies. So we really need to be seeing more of this consultation processes, and we need to respect whether consent is given or not given and cooperate with the decisions of Indigenous people.
Okay, great. I mean, these are all some really good points. I did see a question in the chat that I wanted to quickly address before moving on to our last question. Someone asked here, how can the psychedelic community not replicate these systems of oppression that we're speaking of? I honestly just think that one of the biggest things that people can do is start actually like bringing in BIPOC leadership or migrant leadership or whatever, like start getting these people, and if you're working with organizations, start putting them into like decision-making roles, you know, not like, don't think of it as a diversity hire, like think of this as being like part of the core of your organization now. Like you want to have basically like a BIPOC working plan or something, so that you know that you need to be able to access these communities. As a person who is, you know, trans, non-binary, queer, I have in my organizations, I have a perspective and access to these communities that maybe other people don't because they don't identify there. And with that being said, I want to ask this question about healthcare that someone had posed. So I lost it here. It said, as therapists, clinicians, advocates in the psychedelic field, has anyone considered the impact of housing medicalization through the current broken traditional rigid hierarchical medical model? For example, if only physicians can prescribe, what does this do for clients in rural and underserved communities without enough doctors? Yet there aren't really any mention of any other model, for example, utilizing other advanced practice clinicians who are authorized to prescribe and practice independently in some states. It's something I've been wondering about, and how this will impact BIPOC in the long run, just like our current healthcare system.
Yeah, I could just shoot off of that real quick. That's a beautiful and complicated question, and speaks to why the healthcare system is a business, and we need to remember that, right? And it also has disproportionately harmed Black and Indigenous folks, and so there's a reason why people are going to distrust these systems when seeking really amazing healing experiences, even within psychedelic therapies, right? So this is where I'm also going to do a shout out for Sage Institute, and it kind of being a place. What we're creating is a model that it with hope can be replicated across across the country and it being more accessible. You know, even I've been playing with this idea and probably I pretty much haven't even told this to the stage folks, but like thinking of how to, for the folks who are in rural lands who can't access our services, like, is there a way in which we can cut some of their costs for therapy for travel, right? This is what I'm saying is being really, really creative about accessibility, about reciprocity, about reparations, and really like playing with what that actually means. And then also, of course, if we legalize all drugs, then we can have way more options for replication of psychedelic healing modalities that exist outside of the realm of psychedelic therapies. So we'd have to do that. But right now, it's not safe to just encourage Black and Indigenous folks to do their own healing because they are disproportionately more likely to be incarcerated, criminalized, or killed for their use, even though it can like be as powerful and empathetic of an experience as possible. So that's my point. Thank you.
Yeah, I have something to add. So I think the medical care system is capitalist. The medical care system is dangerous, and it's not made for BIPOC people. It's not made for a lot of the people that we've mentioned in this conversation. And so I think before we're advocating for the integration of certain practices inside of the current medical system, like if we're going to say, oh, we're going to make psychedelic therapy like this little office over here in this hospital that, you know, is racist as fuck to everyone. We should first be talking about alternative models of how we can provide these services. And if that alternative model is like Sage, that they have a sliding scale and they have people of color and they have people that are reflective of the community, that's an amazing place to start. Another place that we can start is engaging with current policies and looking at who the representatives that we elect are, and if they support Medicaid for all or healthcare for all. And like advocating for healthcare for all, because if we all have access to healthcare, then that's at least like the lowest hanging fruit is addressed. But I mean, I just think we need to get rid of this mentality that like the healthcare system is good or that the healthcare system is fine and we're just gonna like work into it, because it's not. And if we collectively like try to figure out ways to dismantle that system too and create alternatives that feel safe for us, then that is a precursor to actually accessing all of these other therapies.
All right. I think that's all the time we have, folks. I really want to thank everyone who's joined us on this call, especially if you had joined us for the first part of the series. We will have another continuation on this series scheduled for about 2 weeks from now. If you are, here registered, then you'll be able to get updates about that. I also would like to thank all of our panelists here, Paula, Danielle, and Yarelix, and myself. I'm here. For giving us such enriching information about all this. I think we, we're able to really collectively answer a lot of people's questions and leave you with a lot of food for thought. There have been a ton of resources shared in the chat. Just know that we will collect all of these resources, these links, and gather them into a document and be able to like email those out to everyone who's been, who subscribed to this series, so that you can continue to do this research outside of that. And yeah, that's all we have time for today. Thank you. Bye, everybody.